welcome to Scare You to Sleep. I'm your host, Shelby Novak, and I'm here to read you a bedtime story. The weather is warm in many parts of the world, which means many of you are spending your time outdoors, swimming, hiking, camping. This week, I have the perfect story to accompany those nights by the campfire. Our story tonight is by author Sarena Nix, whose other work, Leap Year and Devil of the Dark, you may remember hearing on this show. Sarena has another fantastically horrific story for us. This is Richard's Landing. It's always been somewhat of a legend to those of us who live along the river. Our properties are all spread out and private, just how we like it. Each parcel of land is large enough that we can't see our neighbors, and each one is home to a modest cabin, trailer, or RV. Never anything fancy. In fact, most of them are not much more than 4 walls and a roof. But it was enough for anyone living along the river. The yards were upkept at least, since that's where everyone spent most of their time anyway. All except for the plot where an old, decrepit, abandoned barn sat. The barn known as Richard's Landing. Decades ago, Richard and his brother Lenny lived in the barn. The ground level was used to fix up cars and provide shelter to their several goats. In the far back right-hand corner was a ladder that led up to a space that the brothers had turned into a livable studio. Nothing big, just a tiny kitchen, 1 toilet, a shower stall, and room for their 2 beds. And as a welcome to all, hanging above the entrance was an engraved wooden sign reading, Richard's Landing. The brothers spent almost all of their time working on cars, tending to their massive garden out front, and wrangling chickens. They sold their produce, chicken eggs, and goat's milk 15 miles south in the nearest small town. Richard and Lenny were both Vietnam War veterans, although their mother was one of the lucky ones to have both her sons return to American soil. They never really came home completely with the things they saw, the things they did. The 2 men left a part of themselves there. They chose to keep mostly to themselves when they returned, and folks who lived around the river often called them hermits. Like we have every summer for years, my family and I sat in a circle around the campfire and told the story like it was the first time we'd ever heard it. The legend goes like this. Once, in the middle of a beautiful summer day, Lenny was tending to one of the garden beds out front while Richard was working on a transmission or something in the barn. Seemingly out of nowhere, the visitor appeared. He was an old man, tall and thin, his skin crepey and pale. He was wearing a long gray jacket and a black-rimmed hat. Keep in mind, this barn, like the rest of our properties, are miles away from anything. How this old man's withering frame carried him by foot all the way to the barn, nobody knows. The visitor calmly walked over to Lenny, put his hand on his shoulder, and leaned down to whisper something in his ear. Then he turned and left the same way he arrived, wobbly and on foot. Once he was out of sight, Lenny set down his basket of tomatoes and walked into the barn without uttering a word to Richard. He then reached into a toolbox, grabbed a hammer, and brought it down on Richard's head with a wet thud. over and over and over. Lenny smashed his brother's skull until it was a puddle of hair, teeth, and gore. Then he sat down next to him, grabbed the pocket knife from his pocket, and cut his own throat. You would be surprised just how red that amount of blood is. How scarlet red the puddle under his brother was.
Damn it, Paige, you know I hate that story. Must we rehash it every year? It's creepy enough on its own, just driving by it on the way here.
Mom scolded me. My mom was never a fan of the gruesome. While I like all things dark and macabre, my mom is more of a rom-com gal. Every summer, my family comes out to our cabin and camps by the river. My mom and dad sleep in the cabin, while myself, my boyfriend Foster, my sister Maggie, and anyone else who tags along with us sets up tents outside. I don't know why my mother insists on sleeping in the cabin. I know she's no fan of roughing it, but the cabin is hardly an upgrade from the tent. It hasn't been renovated since my grandfather built it decades ago. It's constantly drafty. The linoleum floors look filthy no matter how hard you scrub them. And it's small. One little bedroom, a kitchen boasting a 1,000,000-year-old electric stove, and a bathroom full of daddy long legs. Still, I guess the 4 wooden walls and roof suited her more than a tent. And in all honesty, we love that cabin. It's truly become a happy place for us all.
Is this it? Is this the year we finally do it?
Foster said, taking a swig of his whiskey.
I mean, why not? Aren't we all tired of looking at it? How cool would it look hung up inside our cabin?
Maggie asked, looking at us for approval. Every year, as we sat around the fire and laugh and drink and reminisce, we tell ourselves that this is the year we are going to steal the engraved Richard's Landing sign hanging over the barn door. And every year when we drive by the barn on our way home, it's still hanging there, taunting us. Mom and Dad turn to each other and sort of chuckle.
There's no way in hell you guys are actually going through with it. We do this every year and one of you wusses out,
Dad says, looking at Maggie. She frowns at him and tops off everyone's glass, but as he continues,
we all know the story is bullshit anyway. It's just some story my dad made up to keep us kids occupied since there's nothing else to do out here. Lenny didn't kill Richard. They just moved away without telling anyone because they were a couple of hermits.
My dad had spent many weekends as a teenage boy here at this cabin, and they weren't always the time of his life. When you're an adult, it feels great to unplug for a minute, and you can really appreciate what our gorgeous property has to offer. When you're really young, your imagination can make anything interesting. But when you're 15, 16, you'd rather be with your buddies looking at boobs online, or in magazines if you're my dad's age, or playing video games.
I don't know why, but I think this is the year. I'm totally down. Foster, Maggie, you guys in?
I ask, begging them with my eyes to say yes. They look at each other, both their faces glow a reddish hue from the fire, or maybe from the whiskey. I can tell by the look on their faces that this is it. This is the year we're bringing Richard's Landing down and back to our cabin. We've talked pros and cons 1,000,000 times. We've walked up there only to turn around and head home empty-handed. Not this time.
Suit yourself. We're going to play cards inside while you weirdos go break into the murder house. Don't forget we have no service here when you need to call someone to bail you out of jail,
my mom said, getting up from the fire and dragging my dad by the hand into the cabin.
We're going to need headlamps.
Foster grins.
And maybe a helmet in case Lenny is still there with his hammer,
I add.
Paige!
Maggie yells at me, pushing against my chest.
Why do you always have to say some creepy shit like that?
Maggie turns around and starts heading toward the cabin like a scared dog with its tail between its legs.
Oh, no you don't.
I reach out and grab her hand.
You're not wussing out this time.
Gravel crunched underneath our feet as we made the nearly 1 mile walk to the barn. A feeling of tension and apprehension was thick between the three of us. But so was the feeling of excitement.
Okay, so we're going to have to enter the property a little ways before the barn so the neighbors don't see us snooping,
I said, turning to look at Foster, my headlamp shining directly into his eyes.
Point that thing somewhere else, Paige,
he said, angling it down towards our feet.
The grass is really long, so we should be able to use it to hide. We're going to have to turn our headlamps off when we get close,
Maggie said anxiously, and mostly to herself.
I don't know, guys. What if someone sees us and calls the cops? We're not kids anymore. They could get us for breaking and entering or something like that. Let's just go back and play Cards Against Humanity or something.
Not a chance. I squeezed her hand in an effort to calm her nerves.
Nobody is going to see us or care. It's like 1 a.m. and it's nothing but old people who live out here. They're all asleep. Whatever, let's just get this over with.
Maggie sighed. I know she would be bummed if I let her go home. When Foster and I showed up back at the cabin with the sign in hand, she would wish she had stuck it out. I also hoped she found some solace in the fact that once we had it, we could stop talking about it every year. We walked the rest of the way mostly in silence, surrounded only by the sound of crunching gravel and the occasional cricket. We knew we had reached the far edge of the property line when the grass abruptly went from well-manicured to waist-high and wild.
Okay, turn your lights off,
Foster whispered, reaching up to turn off his own.
We should probably just go in from here and get off the road.
The barn was still about 100 yards away. We could see the top half of it poking out above the grass. I could feel Maggie's trepidation, but I kept hold of her hand and offered her a reassuring smile. As we moved through the tall, dead grass as stealthy as we could, I was surprised by how many blackberry bushes were hiding amongst it. There was no way we would make it through without a few scratches, but with a mix of adrenaline and liquid courage running through our veins, none of us seemed to be bothered much by them. The barn was getting closer, and while I'd passed the thing hundreds of times in my life, it looked more ominous up close than I thought it would. What I noticed first was the front door was gone. Now it looked like an impossibly black hole with the inviting Richard's Landing sign beckoning us in. We couldn't even see an inch into the barn, which allowed our imaginations to run wild. A picture of Richard's pulverized head underneath Lenny as a river of blood flowed from his gaping neck flashed in my head. I shivered and shook it off, taking in the rest of the barn. I was surprised it was still standing. The boards used to build the walls were old and weathered. More than half of them sported holes and termite damage. There were 3 windows down either side and one to the right of the door. Only one of them were still completely intact. Moss was growing up the walls, and the roof had fallen in on itself on one side.
What do you think is in there?
I asked them, pointing to the dark black hole where the door should be.
I really don't want to find out,
Maggie says with a shaky voice.
Damn, that sign is higher than I thought it would be. I'll boost you up there,
Foster said, reaching his hand out to me. Maggie was pacing, trying to get out her nervous energy.
Hurry up, you guys! I don't want to get caught out here.
Foster knelt down and interlaced his fingers, giving me a place to put my foot. I pulled myself up as he lifted me until I had my hands on the bottom of the sign. I gave it a hard pull, but it didn't budge. In the dark, it was hard to tell if it was nailed or screwed in at the top, but it was secure.
Shit, I can't get it. We'll need to pry it off. Maybe there's something inside?
I said. Foster lowered me down as we all came to the realization that we would have to walk through the pitch black doorway. even standing right next to it. The darkness was so thick, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Though we had come here just for the Richard's Landing sign, I couldn't help but be curious as to what we might find inside. The legend of the visitor whispering some secret code or something to Lenny to get him to murder his brother was just that, a legend. There was no reason for us to be scared to go inside, other than the fact that it was likely filled with spiders and we were now moving into the breaking and entering side of things. I told myself that the fact that there wasn't a door meant we weren't necessarily breaking and entering, just entering.
No way. I am not going in there. I'm going back.
Maggie said, unconvincingly. She knew Foster and I were making our way inside, and she wasn't about to be left out there alone.
Well, stay out here and be the lookout then,
I told her. She sighed in defeat, dropped her shoulders, and turned her headlamp back on.
Let's just get this over with.
The three of us took a breath, turned on our lights, and stepped through the threshold. It was filthy inside. I couldn't make out what I was seeing at first. Once my eyes adjusted a little, I realized it was mostly car parts, engines and tools covered with dirt and cobwebs. It smelled musty and damp, like if it were daytime, we would see mold covering the walls or something. We walked in a little further, looking for something to pry the sign off, but also just sort of snooping at this point. Suddenly, Maggie screamed. She lurched backwards, losing her balance and falling to the ground.
Oh my God, what the hell?
She cried, her shaking hand extended and pointed to the right. Foster and I shushed her a little, still trying not to get caught in a barn we didn't own, and followed her hand with our eyes. To the right of the barn were several animal skeletons laying amongst the dirt. There were pens for each of them that once held hay and water, but that was decades ago.
What the hell are those?
Foster walked closer to them, trying to get a better view.
They're too small to be horses. Maybe dogs?
He wondered. I thought for a second.
They're goats,
I said calmly, remembering the story of Lenny and Richard selling goat's milk at the local farmer's market.
But if they just moved away like Dad says, why would they have left all their goats to die? And all their tools?
Maggie stood up, dusting herself off.
This doesn't feel right. Let's just find a crowbar or something and get out of here,
she said.
Wait,
Foster said.
There's a ladder back there. I want to see what's up there while we're here. You guys keep looking for something to pry the sign off while I check it out.
I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little jealous. I wanted to see what was upstairs too, but Maggie was terrified, and I didn't want to force her to go upstairs or stay down here alone with no one but the remains of several goats to keep her company.
Okay, but be quick. This is taking longer than I thought it would,
I admit. Maggie and I go back towards the front of the barn near the engine parts and the tools, as Foster made his way deeper into the filthy barn. Maggie and I dug around a couple of toolboxes, but couldn't find exactly what we needed. By this point, whatever liquid courage we had from the whiskey we drank around the campfire was long gone, and the scratches we got from the unexpected blackberry bushes began to ache a little. We heard the floorboards above creak under Foster's foot, but didn't want to call out to him and alert any neighbors to our trespassing.
He better be taking some pictures,
I said under my breath.
Here,
Maggie loudly whispered.
It's not a crowbar, but I think it should work.
Maggie was holding up a thin piece of piping about a foot long. It was going to have to do. The two of us decided we should get back to work on the sign while Foster checked the upstairs out. By the time he was done, we would be too, and we could make our triumphant walk back to the family cabin. Our parents were going to freak out when they saw that we actually did it. Upstairs, Foster stood at the landing at the top of the ladder. It seemed slightly cleaner up there. There were less cobwebs, but everything was still covered in a thin layer of dust. Foster realized pretty quickly that it must have been Richard and Lenny's living area. There was a super small kitchen, basically a mini stove and mini refrigerator. He noticed there was a saucepan on the stove and walked over to investigate. He shined his light into the pot, and bile rose in his throat. The pot was filled with a blackish sludge. It smelled sweet and rotten, like death and decay. At first he thought it was simmering, but quickly realized the movement in the pot was coming from maggots, feeding off whatever was in there. Jesus! He coughed to himself. He swallowed hard, hoping to keep the contents of his stomach down. The idea that the food in the pot should have been completely dried up at this point, seeing as it's been decades since it was put there, didn't cross his mind. He turned and made his way further through the room. He spotted a small shower stall and a toilet, which he didn't dare peer inside of. He learned his lesson in the kitchen. A few towels littered the floor, but what really gave him an uneasy feeling were the 2 toothbrushes sitting on the sink. Both were covered in grime and hadn't been used probably in his lifetime. There was a small half wall giving the illusion of privacy to the last part of the room. He assumed this is where Richard and Lenny slept. In the corner of the room was a coat rack. It seemed out of place. Not the coat rack itself exactly, but the coat on the rack. The only light in the barn came from his headlamp, and he fixed its attention directly onto the rack. A long gray coat hung from one side. The weird thing about it was how clean it was. No cobwebs or dust or holes made by moths. On the other side hung a black-rimmed hat, just as pristine as the coat. Foster felt his body tense as ice water shot through his veins. The visitor. He pictured his long gray coat and black hat leaning over Lenny, putting his hand on his shoulder and whispering in his ear. He turned his head to the left, and the headlamp swept over the rest of the room. There were 2 beds. One was perfectly made up, dusty and worn, but the blankets had tightly tucked corners, and the pillow was perfectly fluffed. In the other corner, an old man was sitting straight up, looking directly at Foster. Foster tried to run. He tried to scream out to Paige and Maggie, but he couldn't move. Not because he was frozen in fear, he literally couldn't move. His body was in some sort of trance, and he was no longer in control. The old man in the bed was shirtless. He had impossibly good posture. His nearly translucent skin was taut down his straight back. His foggy eyes were fixed on Foster, intensely staring directly into his eyes. Foster stood there, incapable of sound or movement, but completely coherent. He prayed to a god he didn't even believe in, that this was a dream. And if it wasn't a dream, he prayed that Paige and Maggie had left him there and they were safely on their way back to their parents' cabin. The visitor pulled the blanket off the bottom half of his body and calmly, almost methodically, swung his legs over the side of the bed. His knees popped as he stood from the bed and walked, dragging his feet over to Foster. The visitor set a trembling, withered hand on his shoulder and leaned in to speak into Foster's ear. His breath was horrid, like he hadn't opened his dry, cracked mouth in years. A single tear rolled from Foster's eye. The visitor spoke in a low, cracking voice. "I'm hungry again. You may begin the hunt." Maggie wasn't as strong as Foster, so she wasn't much help boosting me up. After trying to boost me with her intertwined fingers like Foster had, we decided she should kneel and I could stand on her knee. I used one hand to balance myself as I shoved the pipe under the L on the Richards Landing sign. I didn't want to crack it. This would all be for nothing if it split in half. So instead of really wrenching on the thing, I slowly worked it back and forth.
"It's coming loose,"
I told Maggie, almost too loud in my state of excitement.
"Holy shit! We're actually going to get this thing."
We could hear Foster coming down from the upstairs section of the barn, and the sound of him rummaging through the tools.
"We've got it, Foster! We don't need another tool!"
Maggie loudly whispered to him. He made his way out of the barn and stood behind us, waiting for me to finish the job. Just then, the sign popped off the wall in one piece. We had finally done it. I hopped off Maggie's knee, and we both laughed. We shared a quiet high five, and I grabbed the sign. We turned around, all smiles, ready to tell Foster we were good to go.
"We're all good, babe. Let's get out of here,"
I say, and I reached out to grab his hand. Instead of his warm fingers curling around mine, like they had so many times before, my hand touched something cold and hard. I looked at what he was holding, hoping it was some cool souvenir from upstairs. But it wasn't. It was a hammer. An old hammer that looked to be covered in rust or something on one side. Maggie and I looked at each other and then back to Foster. Wet lines trailed down his cheeks, but he was silent and expressionless.
"What the fuck, Foster?"
Maggie hissed at him.
"This isn't funny. You can quit trying to scare me now. Let's go."
But Foster didn't move. Instead, he turned to me and raised the hand holding the hammer up over his head. Instinctively, I jumped backwards away from the incoming hammer, air whipped by my face, showing me just how much force he'd put behind the swing.
"What are you doing? Foster, why are you doing this?"
I yelled at him. I hoped the neighbors had heard at this point, but we're so spread out, I didn't have much faith. Maggie and I both started crying, and though Foster was the one wielding the hammer, he seemed to be crying too. Tears rolled down his face, but he didn't make a sound. I dropped the sign, but I kept a hold of the pipe I used to pry it off with. We couldn't run towards the tall grass and back onto the road because Foster was standing directly in front of us. Instead, I grabbed Maggie's hand and I pulled her back into the barn. We were trapped in there, with Foster by the door, and running wasn't an option. When your chance for flight is ripped away, fight becomes your only option for survival. Our headlamps were bouncing wildly as we moved, only illuminating a skinny path of light in whatever direction we looked. Foster was able to reach out and grab Maggie by her hoodie.
"Maggie, no!"
I screamed as I tried to yank her away from Foster's grip. Maggie's eyes were wide, like an animal caught in a trap. She was thrashing and punching and screaming, trying to put some distance between her and the hammer. I saw Foster raise his arm up again, and I threw my body against Maggie in an attempt to push her out of Foster's path. I saw a flash of white light as searing pain shot from my shoulder down my arm. Maggie fell to the floor onto a lumpy tarp, covering some engine parts and tools. Foster had missed his original target, hitting me in the shoulder instead. I couldn't tell if I heard or felt the pop, but the force of the hammer cracked a bone in my shoulder and my arm hung limply at my side. The skin split open and started bleeding. I looked at Foster in shock. I couldn't understand why he was doing this to us. How the man I loved could be trying to hurt me. Maggie was screaming, the sight of my arm serving as evidence that this was really happening. Still holding the pipe, I swung it with my good arm, but Foster was much stronger than me, even when both of my arms were functioning. Foster walked backwards in an attempt to get away from my pipe and tripped over something on the ground. He fell backwards, landing on some rusted old tools. His hands went back to catch himself, and his left hand got caught in a part of an old engine. The force snapped his ring finger. Still, Foster didn't make a sound. He didn't even wince, even though his finger was bent sideways at a 90-degree angle. While Foster was getting up, Maggie pulled the tarp back from the tools on the floor, hoping to find a weapon. What we both saw first wasn't a weapon, though. It was a massive blood stain, the size you might expect to see if two full-grown men had laid in that exact spot and bled out. Maggie instinctively jumped back from the gruesome sight. It was real. Lenny had murdered Richard right here where we were fighting for our own lives. I remembered the legend then. How Lenny had walked into the barn and smashed his brother to pieces without saying a word. The rust on the hammer wasn't rust at all. It was blood. I didn't know why Foster was trying to recreate the events from that evening all those decades ago, but the tears streaming down his emotionless face told me that the visitor had gotten to him too, somehow. Maggie collected herself long enough to search the tools that were under the tarp and came up with the crowbar we could have used earlier. Foster was standing again and making his way towards us. Maggie and I ran to the back of the barn, cornered with the skeletons of the goats. It's not him, Maggie. The legend is real. We've got to get out of here, I cried to my sister. Maggie held the crowbar up over her head.
I don't care who it is. I'm not dying in this fucking barn!
Foster's weeping eyes were fixed on Maggie as he closed in. She swung the crowbar. Foster was able to tuck his head back and miss her swing and quickly retaliated with a swing of the hammer. A loud crack resounded through the barn as the hammer made contact with Maggie's rib cage. All the air from her lungs was forced out at once and she fell to her knees. She dropped the crowbar with a loud clang and desperately tried to catch her breath. A prisoner in his own mind, Foster brought the hammer back up again. I could see it all happening in slow motion with my one good arm. I grabbed the crowbar and quickly swung it at Foster's shin. The force snapped the bone, bending it in the wrong direction. Foster fell over, and I used the opportunity to stand over him. I didn't know if he was still inside his head somewhere. I didn't know if he was just a psychopath who had fooled me for all these years. I just knew that he wouldn't stop until Maggie and I were dead. Foster was trying to stand back up when I raised the crowbar and brought it down on his face. His head whipped to the side, his eyebrows split open, and his nose smashed crooked and flat. I hit him again, feeling the crowbar sink deeper into his head. I raised it up again, screaming in anger and heartbreak and fear as I brought it down. With a wet crunch, the crowbar cracked his skull. With that, what was left of Foster's face changed, and he let out a stifled sob. The first sound he'd made since the attack began. He mumbled, blood and loose teeth slurring his words. I dropped the crowbar and sat down next to him. I held his hand, and I cried and told him I loved him. It didn't take long for his chest to stop moving, as his breathing stopped. Maggie crawled over to me. She was in crippling pain, but alive.
Paige, we have to get out of here. We have to get back to Mom and Dad. They can take us to a hospital,
Maggie said, pulling me to my feet. I didn't want to leave Foster there, in the same place Richard had met a similar fate. But Maggie was right. We had to go. Maggie limped towards the door, and I followed, my arms swinging aimlessly. We made it through the threshold and out into the grassy area. I reached down and grabbed the Richard's Landing sign and turned to Maggie. We got it. Let's never come back here again. As Maggie and I limped our way back through the grass, through the blackberry bushes, and down the gravel road, the visitor slithered its way down the ladder in the barn and claimed his prize. Once his feast was complete, he laid back down in his bed to await his next meal. Thanks for listening, and thank you again to my author this week, Sarena Nix. Again, check out Serena's other work on the show. Again, that's Leap Year and Devil of the Dark. If you'd like to follow the show more closely, you can follow the show on social media at scareyoutosleep on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, where I, just this week, posted some pictures of some of my new merch. I posted some pictures of me in the apron and holding one of the glasses that's available on my merch site, which is available in the show notes. And I was so flattered by the comments I got on those pictures. You sure know how to make a girl blush. Thank you so much for being so kind. I really needed that pick-me-up, and so that was nice. So if you'd like to see some of those items in action, you can see them on my social media. And if you'd like to follow me personally, you can follow me at Shelby B. Novak on Twitter and Instagram. If you have a story you'd like considered for the show, please send it to scareyoutosleep@gmail.com. If it's a true story, please put true story in the subject line. And if it's a fictional story, please make sure it's attached in a separate document where the story isn't just in the body of the text. PDF, Google Drive, doesn't matter, or Google Doc, doesn't matter, just as long as it's a separate document. You can also find the show on Patreon, ad-free, for $1 a month. And for $3 and up, you get bonus episodes. And for my patrons who are listening, I have been working on the final chapter of Frankenstein. I know, finally, it's finally going to be complete. I am about halfway through it. Miss Shelley made that last chapter pretty lengthy, and I've had some construction going on at my dwelling in the apartment above me, and so it's been a little hard to record. I've been having to find times to record. But I am almost done with the final chapter of Frankenstein, and a reminder that means all parts will be available on Patreon, and for $10 and up patrons, you will have access to one solid 8, or I think it's going to be about 8 hours, maybe more, I can't remember, but all parts in one file, basically. It won't be in, you won't have to keep pushing play. It'll be all in one file for $10 and up patrons. So that is coming soon. I know it's been a while. Like I said, that book was in storage during my, what are we calling that year? Let's see, the dark year. It wasn't even quite a year, but so that'll be coming out soon. And what else do I have for you? I don't think there's any. Oh, Nightmare Soup. The show Nightmare Soup has premiered. I don't know if the episodes I'm in have premiered yet, but go check out the show Nightmare Soup. It's a great show for the entire family. It's seriously, like, kids can listen to it. It's based on some books that I believe are, like, specifically for children, kind of in the same vein as, like, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And I was on a good handful of episodes, so go check out Nightmare Soup. That's also from Bloody FM, the network. Oh, and I also wanted to address, I have received your voicemails and your emails and your DMs about my message last week about cutting the rambles down, because I thought maybe I was annoying people with how much I talked. And I guess I am not. Or maybe I am annoying some people, but those who prefer the rambles at the end were much more boisterous. I did not receive a single one saying, thank God I needed you to stop talking. But again, I got voicemails. One of them was so incredible. I want to play it on the show, but I'm waiting for the voicemail episode so I can keep them all in one episode. I don't know if this person sounded like Long Legs on purpose, but I had just seen Long Legs and I was like, are they doing the Long Legs voice? I don't know. But a 3-minute voicemail about how I should be doing the rambles. And again, I got emails, I got DMs from people who were like very upset that I said that I would be not be rambling at the end of the show. This happens if you've listened to the show for long enough, or if you're someone who's been listening back through. I'm very wishy-washy when it comes to the end of the show. For some reason, I just every once in a while get really up in my head and I'm like, no one wants to hear me talk. And I'm like, I'm going to stop doing the rambles at the end because they're too long and I know you can't stand them. And then I get a bunch of people who are like, actually, I really like them. And that's part of the show that I like. So that's on me. Just every once in a while, maybe I'll just kind of get in my head and say that. I don't know. So, let's see, baking. The only thing I baked this week was a Dutch baby. It was something my brother has been raving about for years. And he even got me a cast iron skillet, my first cast iron skillet years ago, and was like, you've got to make a Dutch baby. And I have to say, so sorry to those Dutch baby lovers out there. I thought it was okay. It wasn't that great to me. It was a little too eggy. It was beautiful when it came out of the oven. I ate part of it, but it just wasn't something I probably will ever make again. Again, sorry to the Dutch baby lovers out there. I don't know. I think that's all for this week. Again, thank you for the very kind words I got for those merch pictures. Because I'm, after almost a year of being a voluntary romantic hermit, I'm thinking about getting back out there again, romantically. Maybe on the apps. I don't know. I hear so many horror stories about the apps, but like, what else am I supposed to do? How else do you meet people? Anyway, so it gave me kind of a confidence boost. It really did. I was like, wow, okay, maybe someone will find me attractive. And that means a lot. I'm going to go. And I just wanted to give that last thank you again for boosting my ego is what it is. We'll just say it. Giving me that ego boost. And I'm going to let you have a wonderful evening, hopefully. I hope you have an incredible weekend. I hope you've been wanting something to happen, and it happens this week. Like, I hope you get that raise, or I hope that person texts you, or I hope you get to see that movie, or just something that you have been really wanting. I want you to have a win this week, and I'm sending that out through the airwaves to you, that you have a win this week, because you deserve a win. I know I get a little woo sometimes, sorry, but I can't help it. Okay, why don't you go get some sleep? Sweet dreams.
Let's face it, life in Mayfair can take a little getting used to.
You've reached Alternative Biome Normalization Services. What can I do for you?
Hi. This is the exterminators, right? There's a thing outside my house. I think it's eating my driveway.
We handle things differently here.
Hey, Jim. I'm outside your work right now, and the whole building is just gone? I know you said you weren't in on Wednesdays, but is this what you meant?
And if you don't know what's going on, that can be scary.
911, what's your emergency?
Please, help me.
What is the nature of your emergency, ma'am?
I thought it would go away if I stopped feeding it, but now it's in the house.
Ma'am, please try to calm down.
Join the Mayfair Watchers Society, a found footage horror anthology podcast made in collaboration with horror artist Trevor Henderson. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and at mayfairwatchers.com.
Hello, I'm Malik.
I'm Jamie.
And this is World Gone Wrong, where we discuss the unprecedented times we're living through.
Can your manager still schedule you for night shifts after that werewolf bit you?
My ex-boyfriend was replaced by an alien body snatcher, but I think I like him better now.
Who is this dude showing up in everyone's old pictures?
My friend says the sewer alligators are reading maps now.
When did the kudzu start making that humming sound?
We are just your normal millennial roommates processing our feelings about a chaotic world in front of some microphones.
World Gone Wrong, a new fiction podcast from Audacious Machine Creative, creators of Unwell, a Midwestern Gothic mystery. Learn more at audaciousmachinecreative.com.
Find World Gone Wrong in all the regular places you find podcasts.
I love you so much. I mean, you could, up the energy a little bit.
You could up the energy.
I actually don't take notes.
That was good.
I'm just kidding. You sounded great.
So did you.